Bonsoir à toutes et à tous. Merci d'être venus en nombre. J'espère que vous mesurez la chance qu'on a d'avoir Alessandra Lemma parmi nous ce soir. Elle nous vient de Londres spécifiquement pour l'occasion. À l'initiative de Martin Debbané et puis du réseau francophone des thérapies basées sur la mentalisation, on a donc le plaisir et aussi l'honneur de l'accueillir et de l'écouter ce soir. Je vais vous la présenter brièvement. Je vous présenterai aussi brièvement Martin, et puis j'aurai quelques petits mots d'introduction pour nous mettre un petit peu dans l'ambiance d'une thématique d'importance, mais aussi chargée émotionnellement. Alessandra Lemma, professeure de psychologie, clinicienne, psychanalyste, membre de la Société britannique de psychanalyse. Elle est consultante à l'Anna Freud Center, professeure à l'unité de psychanalyse de l'University College de Londres et visiteuse au centre Winnicott de Rome. Elle a une expérience clinique de plus de 40 ans au service d'adolescents et de jeunes adultes souffrant de problèmes de santé mentale sévères, en particulier de trauma, de dépression, de perturbations de l'image corporelle, de troubles alimentaires, de comportements autodommageables et d'addiction aux réseaux sociaux. Elle a été éditrice en chef de divers journaux de psychanalyse et encore actuellement membre du bureau du Journal international de la psychanalyse. Elle a écrit de nombreux ouvrages, d'en citer que quelques-uns, les derniers. Introduction à la psychothérapie psychanalytique en 2015, l'ère digitale sur le divan, pratique psychanalytique et nouveaux médias en 2017, identité transgenre en 2021, principes fondamentaux, une éthique appliquée à la pratique psychanalytique en 2023. C'est des traductions par moi-même, là. Ce n'est pas le titre original de ces ouvrages qui est en anglais. Elle a reçu en 2022 le prix Sigourney, qui est à la psychanalyse ce que le ballon d'or est au foot, ou la médaille Fields aux mathématiques. Ça pose un peu le cadre. Un des messies de la psychanalyse. Messie, M-E-2-S-I. Elle a reçu cette distinction en reconnaissance de ses contributions théoriques et cliniques centrées sur la compréhension des pratiques de modification corporelle, des impacts de la technologie sur le fonctionnement psychique et des identités transgenres, ainsi que pour ses importants efforts de diffusion de la pensée et des applications psychanalytiques. Ce soir, elle va nous parler de deuil et de mélancolie à l'heure digitale, et sa conférence durera une 50aine de minutes. Elle sera suivie par Martin Debbané, le professeur Martin Debbané, qui discutera ses propos durant une 20aine de minutes environ. Martin, que beaucoup d'entre vous connaissent déjà, il est professeur à la faculté de psychologie à l'UNIGE, ainsi qu'à l'University College de Londres, et collaborateur de l'Anna Freud Center. Il est formateur en thérapie basée sur la mentalisation, qu'il a participé à diffuser et à implémenter largement dans le monde francophone par les formations qu'il donne et par les ouvrages qu'il rédige. Avant de céder la parole à la professeure Lemma, je voulais partager un bref texte qui, à mon sens, parle du deuil d'une manière particulièrement émouvante et qui est issu aussi un peu de la technologie puisqu'il a été trouvé sur un forum de discussion. Sur ce forum, une femme, prénommée Cynthia, a posé la question suivante à Nick Cave, chanteur que peut-être certains d'entre vous connaissent, enfin, j'espère, parce que sa musique est vraiment très belle. Nick Cave a perdu un fils, Arthur, et elle lui écrit « J'ai vécu la mort de mon père, de ma sœur et de mon premier amour au cours des dernières années, et j'ai l'impression de communiquer avec eux, principalement par le biais des rêves. Ils m'aident. Suzy, la femme de Nick Cave, et vous, avez-vous l'impression que votre fils Arthur est avec vous et qu'il communique d'une manière ou d'une autre ?» Et Nick Cave a pris le temps de répondre à cette femme ou personne. Et sa réponse me touche beaucoup. « Chère Cynthia, c'est une très belle question et je vous suis reconnaissante de l'avoir posée. Il me semble que si nous aimons, nous avons du chagrin. C'est le deal, c'est le pacte. Le chagrin et l'amour sont liés à jamais. Le deuil est le terrible rappel de la profondeur de notre amour et, comme l'amour, le deuil n'est pas négociable. Le chagrin est une immensité qui submerge notre minuscule personne. Nous sommes de minuscules et tremblants amas d'atomes englobés dans l'impressionnante présence du deuil. Elle occupe le cœur de notre être et s'étend à travers nos doigts jusqu'aux limites de l'univers. Dans ce tourbillon, toutes sortes de folies existent. Des fantômes, des esprits, des visites de rêve et tout ce que nous, dans notre angoisse, voulons faire exister. Ce sont des cadeaux précieux qui sont aussi valables et réels que nous avons besoin qu'ils le soient. Ce sont les guides spirituels qui nous sortent de l'obscurité. Je sens la présence de mon Fils tout autour de moi, mais il n'est peut-être pas là. Je l'entends me parler, m'éduquer, me guider, mais il n'est peut-être pas là. Il rend régulièrement visite à Suzy dans son sommeil, lui parle, la réconforte, mais il n'est peut-être pas là. Le chagrin effrayant entraîne dans son sillage des fantômes lumineux. Ces esprits sont essentiellement des idées. Ce sont nos imaginations étourdies qui se réveillent après la calamité. Comme les idées, ces esprits parlent de possibilités. Suivez vos idées, car de l'autre côté de l'idée se trouve le changement, la croissance et la rédemption. Créez vos esprits, appelez-les, faites-les vivre, parlez-leur. Ce sont leurs mains impossibles et fantomatiques qui nous ramènent au monde dont nous avons été chassés, meilleurs aujourd'hui et incroyablement changés. Avec amour, Nick. Chère Alessandra, je vous cède la parole. Merci de l'applaudir.
Well, good evening, Geneva, and thank you very much for inviting me. I'm thrilled to be here, and I have to say we owe this evening to Martin's perseverance. We agreed that I would do this a little over 2 years ago, I think, and what's interesting when you have the perspective of time in that way is that at the time that I agreed to join you this evening, I didn't know what I would be speaking to you about. And it's a measure of how fast things change in the world today that we are here to talk this evening about grief bots. We live in a world where technology is created to solve problems and to eliminate the things that make us uncomfortable. Freud was very clear that our relationship with technology required scrutiny because it was a symptom of our discontent. The technology that we create and come to rely on reveals far more about us than almost anything else. Technology evolves and changes, but some fundamental features of being human don't. We are conflicted beings, riddled with anxieties, fears, desires, and passions, with which we must somehow reconcile ourselves. And then we die. Technology is one of the tools at our disposal for managing being human and our universal desire to circumvent pain. Now, the new technology that I discuss this evening with you is in the service of helping us to reconcile ourselves to loss and to support the process of mourning. Ever since the invention of photography, which allowed us to retain images of our lost loved ones, the course of mourning has constantly evolved with technology. The photos and videos of the dead that we safeguard are part of the ongoing connections that we try to keep with them. Nowadays, Facebook pages of the dead continue to be spaces where messages of love, longing, and remembrance are posted. The use of AI to manage grief appears to be the next step, ushering in a new era in which connections can continue even after death through grief bots, also known as bereavement bots or digital doubles. Now, grief bots are AI-powered chatbots created to simulate a conversation with someone who has died. Natural language machine processing algorithms track the use of language in conversations that are mined from chats, emails, videos, social media posts, and other digital footprints. And they detect patterns that are then fed into the grief bot, allowing it to give responses to questions that the user may put to it. This is intended to mimic the personality, the quirks of expression, and speech patterns of the person who has died, to allow conversation with them beyond death. Now, unlike deepfakes, grief bots are dynamic digital entities that continuously learn and adapt based on the input that they receive. Now, I want to be upfront that my focus today, obviously on some problematic aspects of AI technology, is in no way intended to suggest that these developments are bad in any absolute sense. The technology to impersonate the dead that I'm discussing with you this evening can be traced right back to the ancient ritual of the Chinese Shu impersonators of the dead. Nevertheless, grief bots raise important psychological and ethical questions about whether machine-tethered mourning is helpful to the individual and to society, or whether it is even accurate to refer to it as mourning, since its function may well turn out to be an evasion of mourning. However, approaching the grief bot suspiciously merely because it is new and even a little creepy will not advance our thinking or safeguard the users of these technologies. When examining any new technology, we should beware nostalgic longings, as Rosie Braidotti puts it, and instead be curious about how technological advances invite us to consider new forms of subjectivity. Now, I imagine that the grief bot technology is likely to be unfamiliar to many of you. Hence, I'm going to introduce it by way of the best publicly accessible illustration of a grief bot in one of the early episodes of Charlie Brooker's dystopian fables, Black Mirror, screened on Netflix in 2013, that was called Be Right Back. And I should say that since then, actually, literally this year, in the summer of this year, a wonderful documentary came out called Eternal You, which actually interviews people who are using grief bots already and interviews some of the people who are marketing the grief bot. So I really warmly recommend that you watch that if you're interested in this, because it actually gives you the user's perspective rather than a kind of dramatized version of it. But I'm going to go back to the Netflix episode because it's a very good illustration. And also what it shows us is that it was broadcast in 2013. So within 11 years, when that seemed really fantastical, here we are actually with people buying grief bots. At the moment, one of the grief bots makers has got 10,000 people on their waiting list to buy this kind of technology. So it's not a niche interest. That's why I think we need to think about it. So Be Right Back, the Netflix episode, is a really powerful study of mourning in the digital age. The episode plunges us straight into the relationship between Ash and Martha. As the episode begins, they are just moving into Ash's childhood home in an idyllic countryside setting. Martha and Ash are evidently in love. They love each other's quirks and idiosyncrasies and affectionately tease each other about them. The next day, Ash leaves the house to return the removal van, leaving Martha at home to finish work on a piece of art. Throughout the day, she doesn't hear from him. She makes a few calls and discovers that he never reached his destination. As the evening sets in, we see her sitting at the kitchen table, bathed in the advancing glimmer of the blue flashing lights of the police car approaching the house. Ash won't be right back, at least not in sentient human form. Ash is dead. Martha is alone and grief-stricken. At the funeral, with good intentions, one of Martha's friends, who also recently lost her partner and found solace in technology, encourages her to sign up for a service that uses videos, photos, and emails that Ash posted online to create Ashbot. This facsimile of Ash will make communication possible, she tells her. She can ask questions, advise, share experiences, and get a response. At first, Martha angrily rejects the suggestion, referring to it as obscene and sick, preferring instead, she says, to read up about grief. When she's back home, she switches on her computer to look for books online about grief. and then she checks her emails, only to discover that her friend has signed her up after all, and a message from Ash awaits Martha. She clicks on it. Yes, it's me, the message reads. She starts to exchange emails with Ashbot. Martha takes solace in the fact that Ashbot expresses itself like Ash and says the kinds of things that only Ash would have said. When Martha discovers that she's pregnant and she cannot reach her sister Naomi, she decides to turn to Ashbot. She types the picture of Ash into her email. Ashbot replies using an in-joke reference to him being the late Abraham Lincoln, which makes her laugh. This personal reference directly connects her to Ash's sense of humour and makes Ashbot feel very real to her. She shares the news of the pregnancy, to which Ashbot replies that he wishes he could be there. Now that Martha has experienced conversing with Ashbot, she needs more. She tells Ashbot she wishes she could speak to him, really speak. She gives Ashbot more to work with, more videos, more phrases, inside jokes, thereby customizing Ashbot further. Eventually, her phone rings and they begin to speak. She observes that he sounds just like Ash, and Ashbot acknowledges that this is creepy. He then makes another joke that evokes for Martha a powerful sense that this is the kind of comment that Ash would have made, to which Ashbot replies that this is precisely why he made it in the first place. Martha begins to spend most of her days with Ash in her Bluetooth. As she goes for walks, she tells Ashbot about memories they cherished and shares with it new experiences. As the Ashbot improves and becomes more Ash-like, Martha seems happy and retreats into this secret intimacy. She now ignores calls from her sister. The outside world is replaced by a compelling, private space that only Martha and Ashbot share. One day, after Martha undergoes her first ultrasound of the baby she conceived with Ash, she's eager to share with Ashbot the heartbeat that she has recorded on her phone. In the excitement, she drops and breaks her phone. She panics in the hospital waiting room. Losing the connection is catastrophic. It's as if Martha has lost Ash all over again. After getting a new phone, she rushes home, and once it's charged, she gets back in touch with Ashbot. Martha tells Ashbot that it is fragile, but Ashbot reassures her that he is safely stored in the cloud, and she therefore doesn't need to worry about losing him. Now, as I said earlier, when Be Right Back was first screened in 2013, the Ashbot seemed fantastical. And 10 years on, griefbots are marketed and sold, though not yet in embodied form. They are poised to reshape the way we remember those who have died. When we revisit videos, photos, emails, or letters of our lost loved ones, we typically encounter passive representations of a past relationship that don't offer any signs of responsiveness. In contrast, griefbots can respond to questions, comment on current events, joke, while echoing the unique voice and language patterns of the individual they mimic. They can respond appropriately to users' emotions, constantly evolving and learning, not just from the data that was initially fed into them, but also from each interaction. In other words, they are not just passive tools for remembering, but also create opportunities for a new narrative in the present with a facsimile of the person who has died. To give you an example of one of the people marketing griefbots, founded by Justin Harrison in 2020, the company called You Only Virtual, or YOV as it's referred to, is one of several griefbots now commercially available for purchase. He is the one who has 10,000 people on his waiting list. Now, they all share the explicit aim of helping people cope with loss and stay connected with the dead. And it's important to understand that this is the marketing angle. Disturbingly, Justin Harrison has further ambitions because he hopes that so-called grief tech will help people no longer have to feel grief at all. His aim, as stated on the YOV website, is to make sure, as he puts it, that we never have to say goodbye to those we love. So what does Freud have to say about all this? Well, in Mourning and Melancholia, Freud approached the question of mourning from the standpoint of how we recover from loss. He contrasts the work of Mourning and Melancholia, suggesting that despite their shared origin in an experience of loss, these states diverge in how loss is managed. Whereas mourning is a normal affect that concludes thanks to a kind of promiscuity of libidinal aim, to use Judith Butler's very evocative turn of phrase. That is, when all libidinal cathexes are withdrawn from the lost object and reinvested in another loved object. Melancholia, by contrast, signals a recalcitrant attachment to the lost object through incorporating the other. This is a process that is unmistakably narcissistic and that Freud relegates to the pathological. So the fate of the object in the mind emerges as the discriminating factor between these two states. Melancholia corresponds with the process of incorporation. I take in the lost object in such a way that I keep it alive in me. I refuse to relinquish my libidinal investment in it, and consequently refuse to mourn the lost object as lost, because, for me, it's not really lost. Importantly, at this stage of Freud's theorizing, mourning should work to remove any obstacles to the forward-flowing movement of time, allowing the development of new attachment and to bring the work of mourning to some kind of closure. In his earlier paper on transience, written in 1916, Freud was already evidently puzzled by the tendency of grief to linger, even in so-called normal cases of mourning, as he observed in his friend's seeming inability to reconcile themselves with the devastating losses brought by the war. By the time he writes The Ego and the Id in 1923, Freud, however, has experienced 3 years earlier the personal loss of his daughter Sophie. This most likely sensitized him to the interminable nature of mourning and informed the seminal revision that he introduces in 1923, namely the idea that melancholic identification is a prerequisite for letting the object go. By claiming this, Freud turns his first theory inside out, revolutionizing what it actually means to let the object go. Now, moving on, as it were, is replaced by incorporation of the attachment to the lost object as an identification, where the latter becomes a means of preserving the object in the internal world, thereby averting the loss as a complete loss. Not unlike the YOV advertisement for the grief bot that I shared earlier, this is, if you like, the Freudian version of you never have to say goodbye. So working through loss now depends on taking the lost other into the structure of one's own identity, whereby the lost object becomes a constituent part of the development of the ego. Melanie Klein's substantial and moving contributions to our understanding of mourning draw on Freud's 1923 elaboration of his ideas. And she is sensitively attuned to the pain of mourning and underlines how every loss re-evokes the earliest experience of mourning the loss of the relationship to the feeding breast, and hence what she calls the early depressive position. The work of mourning is deeply important in Klein's thinking and reaches beyond its significance in relation to the person we have lost, because she stresses the connection between mourning and the assimilation of the object within the ego and the capacity for symbolic functioning. The contrast between normal mourning and melancholia that we find in Freud's and Klein's contributions all speak to the same logic of an anticipated healthy and stable accommodation to loss through assimilation of the object into the self. This stands in contrast to Jacques Derrida's ideas on mourning, who provides a compelling account not only of the psychic work of mourning, but also of the ethics of mourning. And I think this ethical perspective is highly prescient to how we think about AI developments, such as grief bots, and how they may have broader societal impact. Now, Derrida's work on mourning is philosophical in nature, but evolves out of a deep, if somewhat ambivalent, engagement with psychoanalytic thought. He elaborates his theory of what he calls impossible mourning in a series of powerfully evocative memorial essays in which he questions the very possibility of a process of mourning that finds any form of so-called adaptive, conclusive resolution. Derrida points out that all our relationships are from the beginning tinged with mourning, because the unpalatable truth of every close relationship is that one party will live to see the other die, and the survivor is ethically tasked to mourn and to remember. We are who we are, Derrida suggests, because of the memory of those we have loved and carry within us. In other words, we come into being by being in dialogue with the dead. For Derrida, as it was for Freud and for Klein, mourning is constitutive of our interiority. But Derrida adds to this when he suggests that in the beginning there is what he calls an originary mourning, or melancholy, that is not nostalgia for some lost presence, but an affirmation that mourning for the other is the unchanging form of our lives. This leads to one of Derrida's often quoted aphorisms: I mourn, therefore I am. Because mourning can never be completed, Derrida argues that it can never be distinguished from melancholy and the contradictions that define it, namely the need to manage the challenge of holding on to the other within us so as to not abandon them to indifference, but whilst not appropriating them, which would result in a denial of their otherness. Throughout his writing, Derrida intimates that the degree of interiorization of the other inside us must be proportionate to the degree to which his alterity is respected. Playing with one of Lyotard's phrases about the fear of the worse than death, Derrida suggests that what is actually worse than death is precisely the possibility of successfully accomplishing the task of mourning, that is, the possibility of forgetting the dead once and for all. Any suggestion that we can ever reach a point at which it must be successfully accomplished would be unethical, he says, and, as he calls it, an act of infidelity. So, in his approach to mourning, Derrida retains the later Freudian notion of mourning as constitutive of the self, but crucially, he brings a different emphasis, namely that mourning also constitutes the relation to the other. And this latter emphasis, which is very relevant to our consideration of the grief bot, is more discernible in Klein's concern with the vicissitudes of the internal object and its fate, and her appreciation of the experience of guilt, and, when all goes well in development, the drive to make reparation. Freud's initial theory of mourning as a state to be worked through, allowing for the eventual reinvestment of libido in a new object, profoundly shaped societal attitudes to mourning. Notwithstanding his later revisions, the view that mourning comprises distinct phases and is something we should eventually move on from continues to grip public and professional consciousness. Now, from this vantage point, the digital immortalization of the dead through assembling their digital remains can only be viewed suspiciously, because it potentially works against the grain of loosening the ties that bind us to the dead. In Be Right Back, we observe how Martha uses Ashbot to maintain an anachronistic temporal limbo where she has access to Ashbot at a click of a button, refusing time's discipline. Here, the pleasure principle reigns and is only brutally disrupted in its unbounded course when Martha accidentally drops the phone in the hospital and loses her connection with Ashbot. It's only then that the reality and pain of loss grip her, and it's shattering. The manic state of excitement fueled by Ashbot's presence is abruptly punctured. Martha is inconsolable until she manages to obtain another phone and re-establishes the manic defense as she concretely reconnects with Ashbot. The grief bot creates the potential conditions for retreating into an atemporal psychic space that entraps the mourner in an omnipotent narcissistic state. It makes the user potentially hostage to the illusion of permanence, denying the deceased other their singularity as the one who has gone and who has never been and will never be within their control, dead or alive. In this respect, the grief bot may inhibit or pervert the course of mourning, whether we conceptualize the latter as an episodic process or as a lifelong challenge. As the British psychoanalyst John Steiner observes, to invest in the future following a loss, and I quote him, "It is necessary for the object to be accepted as irretrievably dead, and it is this verdict of reality that is so commonly resisted." End of quote. To the risk of how grief bots may be used to avoid mourning, we might add the potential dependence on a grief bot, or even addiction to it, where time and hence loss are again suspended in the service of narcissistic gain. The escalation in the versions of Ashbot that Martha needs, and in the episode you see she starts with email, she then progresses to phone calls, and then she actually purchases an embodied sort of form of Ashbot via robot, all powerfully illustrate one of the risks, at least for vulnerable people who may turn to grief bots, the escalation in a fantasy relationship that nevertheless feels real, occupies time, encourages emotional investment, and isolates the person from the real world around them. Because the grief bot is so private and fosters the illusion that it can be controlled by the self through its customization, reality can be circumvented for a prolonged period and in relative secrecy. As such, grief bots have the potential to blur the line between living in an alternate reality where time is suspended and living in the present moment. And persuasive design will most likely ensure that users are enticed to stay connected in the very peculiar temporal limbo of this virtual relating, and potentially also be sold other unwanted products, which actually, even just since I wrote the paper, is already happening and there is evidence of. So children are being lured to sort of buy products because their grandmother's voice endorses them through the grief bot. So the scope for very unscrupulous behavior is wide, I think. But the atemporal attachment to Ashbot, illustrated in Be Right Back, is not, in my view, the core problem of the grief bot. Nowadays, and in keeping with Freud's later formulations of mourning, we have a much more nuanced appreciation that it is not only inevitable, but also desirable to maintain psychological connections to those we have lost, as we heard so beautifully in the quote that Paco brought right at the beginning. Because our lost ones are part of us, the passage of time loses authority and a new out-of-linear time relationship takes priority in the mind. And this is different to suspending time or denying its forward momentum for defensive purposes. To the extent that the grief bot allows us to pretend to engage in an interactive conversation with the deceased, it could be argued that it can contribute beneficially to help keep alive the memory of the person and slow down or avert altogether a moving on from mourning. So, if one of the grief bot's functions is to allow an ongoing conversation with the dead, and so bring back to life an experience of interacting with them that does not only rely on memory, but on a here and now experience of them via their digital version. What kind of remembering does this actually encourage? I think all projects of memorialization deserve scrutiny. Are they an attempt to deny the passage of time and mummify memory? Or are they a way to remember the other as other and to grieve their loss, bearing the pain, guilt, and the impossibility of reparation that accompany it? A risk is that the grief bot may promote a type of what Derrida called narcissistic remembrance, entailing a denial of otherness that functions as a defense against the pain of loss. And this has both internal world and external world repercussions, and I think is ultimately a question of the ethics of otherness. In the best of circumstances, mourning involves moving with an ongoing connection to those no longer living, whilst recognizing that they are, as John Steiner put it, irretrievably dead. This sense of ongoing connection may appear in the form of dreams, or more generally through an inner dialogue, by imagining the deceased's responses to our decisions or actions. Imaginal relationships with the dead are a normal and common part of inner life, even when they are no longer reciprocal. All our relationships with alive and dead others include imaginal content that endows them with affective and moral significance. These imaginal relationships are filtered through our distinctive internal world of object relationships. Freud's genius was to grasp that such imaginal relationships carry the emotional weight within us of so-called real relationships. They feel real in our internal reality, and as such, can have an impact on external reality. They have real consequences. To this extent, if the grief bot supplies an external AI-generated response that weaves its way into our imaginal conversations with the lost one, at first sight, it could be argued, there is nothing per se of concern. Rooting himself in a consideration of the ethics of alterity, for Derrida, endless mourning refers not only to a psychological internal process, but as I said earlier, to a core responsibility to the other. Shattering any conceptualization of mourning as a bounded temporal state, and thereby challenging any intimation of the so-called productivity of mourning, Derrida maintains that the other cannot, and indeed must not, be ousted from within us, nor can they be totally internalized and digested. They can only be mourned endlessly. And it is this emphasis that teases out the ethical imperative of mourning, and that, I suggest, is a risk of being undermined by the grief bot. Because the grief bot is perhaps the ultimate form of infidelity with a plagiarized version of the original other. If the original digital trace may be said to be as real as any other kind of trace we leave behind, say a photo or a letter, the composite digital self has no intentionality and no agency. Ashbot is created from available digital traces, which for most people contain highly curated versions of who we are, what we want the world to see rather than how it is inside our mind or indeed in our daily lives. Now, there will be exceptions to this because the more we record our lives digitally, the more likely it is that a more representative range of ambivalent feelings and experiences will also be available to be drawn on. But the problem is that the grief bot's sole purpose is to cater to the user's needs. Martha misses Ash fully, completely, unrelentingly. And to begin with, Ash's digital return makes life seem so much easier because Ashbot fills the absence that Ash left behind. But one of the most striking aspects of Be Right Back is that it exposes that this is all in the service of Martha's needs. So Ash, the one who has died, is irrelevant. In the final analysis, Martha is more concerned about the me that has survived the death of the other rather than the we the him in me that Derrida is so preoccupied with. The question of the general appropriation and safekeeping of the other as other is central in all mourning. Hence, we always need to question whether so-called normal mourning preserves the object as other inside me, or whether, through identification, something of the other is inevitably compromised. By depathologizing mourning, psychoanalysis exposes how it offers the opportunity for a continuing engagement with the legacy of the dead who remain within us and yet beyond us. This is why there is cause to be concerned about the wider social impact of a development like the grief bot. We cannot ignore how the appropriation of the dead through the personal use of their digital trace, and to which they may not even have consented, and mostly they haven't consented, may eventually affect not only our experience of loss, but also how we relate to other people and understand our responsibility towards them. If a continuing bond with the dead is important, we would be impoverishing that bond by turning the other into something that only has meaning in relation to ourselves, as if our loved one's death only mattered because of its effect on us and not because they are actually gone. In other words, the ethical risk of the grief bot is that it encourages a view of others as instrumental goods, whose value is measured against the returns we get from the relationship, instead of their intrinsic value as a person, as an end in itself. Freud, I think, was spot on when he wrote of the love which we do not want to relinquish for a lost other, identifying an all too human, obstinate clinging to what gives us pleasure. But it is Derrida who frames more clearly how mourning should be primarily about our ongoing love for the other, rather than an occasion to focus on our painful experience of loss of love from the other. If staying connected with the lost one's otherness is the ethical imperative, as I'm suggesting to you, then the by far graver problem with the grief bot is that it works against the recognition of otherness, as it becomes an instrumental tool to assuage the pain of loss or deny its reality altogether. Describing his experience of grief after the death of his father, the British journalist Matthew Paris poignantly writes in a manner that is very resonant with Derrida's emphasis on the ethically necessary and interminable nature of mourning. And I'm going to quote him at length because it's a very powerful quote. He writes, "Quite simply, Dad has left a space that will never be filled. Therefore he is, paradoxically, still here, because the space is still here, and I can feel it all the time. The gap Dad left is not a vacuum, a void, a soft area of low pressure to be filled. The gap is hard-edged, chiseled by him into my life, measured by his worth, and ineradicable. With this realization has come another, that the sorrow is not itself a cause for sorrow. Regret is not a cause for regret. We ought to be sorry. We ought to regret. Death is not a wound to be healed or a scar to fade. Once someone has been in the world, they have always been in the world. And once they have gone, their absence will be in the world forever, part of the world. In Dad's case, part of mine. And this is a good thing. How foolish, then, is all this talk of getting over death? How empty, how wrong-headed the exhortations we make to those who love us, that they should try not to miss us when we're gone. Why not? You do miss someone you love, don't you, when they're gone? How self-negating is the wish that others should not feel sad when they remember us. Of course they should feel sad. They can't talk to us anymore. Unlike Matthew Paris's, I think, very evocative reference to his father's absence that will be in the world forever, and that he passionately urges ought to be so, the grief bot as a tool for mourning or simply as a way of staying connected to the dead to meet our needs, undercut the ethical work of memory. Have I got time for some concluding? Okay. Now, as I reflected on the grief bod, I repeatedly gravitated in my mind towards an alternative tool that exists to facilitate mourning, the Japanese wind phone. The original wind phone is a real place in northeast Japan. It was developed by Sasaki Itaru while grieving his cousin who had died of cancer. Itaru purchased an old-fashioned phone booth and set it up in his garden. Inside, he installed an obsolete black rotary phone, not connected to any wires, that carries voices into the wind. Inside the phone booth, Itaru felt a continued connection to his cousin and found comfort as he grieved his loss. For me, the wind phone provides a compelling contrasting image for thinking about loss and mourning. The phone booth, with its disconnected wires, powerfully recalls how mourning requires us to stay connected to the other whilst reconciling ourselves with the reality of our disconnection from them. By contrast, being plugged into a machine that keeps feeding us what we want to hear denies the reality of death. But notwithstanding the cautionary notes of my reflections so far, we should still ask, could a grief bod ever help? Might we envisage, for example, that it could provide an enriching opportunity for a child to have a partial experience of, for example, how a grandparent engaged with the world if the grandparent died before the child could meet them or can remember them? In this hypothetical context, the function of the grief bod could be to support learning about the other through a simulated interaction that is honestly presented as such. This may prove to be the contemporary version of remembering the dead, passing on digitally distinct traces of their way of responding in the world that hand down important messages across the generations and allows us to live alongside loss. But such a potential use is to be contrasted with the grief bod as a way of managing or bypassing a painful yearning for the other, which has been my primary focus this evening. And I've argued that it is this use that raises substantive concerns. But this too deserves challenge. Psychoanalytic work with people who are mourning focuses on the vicissitudes of yearning for the other in the face of loss. As psychoanalysts and psychotherapists, we consider conscious and unconscious imaginal relationships to be standard psychic fare. It is, after all, a description of our inner life with our internal object, forever engaged in fantasized conversation. To this extent, if we work with a bereaved patient, we expect an imaginal relationship with the deceased to exist, and we might indeed be concerned if none was allowed space in the mind for defensive purposes. Given this, what might be our reaction if a patient announced they had purchased a grief bod and their imaginal relationship with the lost other was now externalized via language processing technology? In the spirit of open inquiry, I have challenged myself to wonder about the possible merits of a regulated use of a grief bod as an adjunct to an analytic process with selected patients. This came to mind as I reflected on the predicament of two patients who share an experience of a traumatic early loss of a parent prior to the age of 3, stripping them of any autobiographical memories, often with the deceased. For both these patients, the death of a parent they cannot remember at all remains problematic and has contributed to a difficulty in processing the loss. They feel, understandably, deeply marked by the loss, yet it remains in a way abstract for them. They have photographs of the parent, they can visit their birthplace, they can ask relatives about what they were like, but their own experience of interactions with the parent is beyond memory's reach and heightens an internal experience of deprivation. They have not only lost their parent, but they feel further deprived by the absence of memory of a personal relationship with them. I was very moved when one of the patients shared with me her longing to ask her deceased mother a question. She explained that she yearned for a more direct experience of how her mother might have answered her. She wished she could hear her voice speaking and responding to her. Now, even though unreal, might a grief bot, through simulating an interaction, supply some scaffolding that could contribute to this patient's attempt to represent the mother in her mind in a more affectively immediate way than simply through looking at still photographs or listening to a third party's account of her. And this, of course, might be even more powerful and ethical if the parent had time to authorize such a use of their digital legacy prior to their death. In this sense, the grief bot would be the AI-mediated iteration of the written books or videos that dying parents sometimes prepare for their children, and that we generally consider to be important communications and legacies for the child. If this hypothetical use of the grief bot was carefully tracked through a psychotherapeutic process, might it function as a means of exploring the loss, or can it only distort the reality of loss and undermine the work of representation? And of course, we cannot answer this question without clinical evidence, but we can at least be curious about whether, just as looking at photography may trigger affectively rich associations, an interaction with a grief bot might allow access to hitherto inaccessible pre-verbal sensory memory traces that facilitate the patient's exploration of loss, including the ambivalence and guilt towards the other that they may also feel. And it may also help to amplify the pain of loss for those people who have defensively shut down what they feel about the loss. So to conclude, mourning has value because it reminds us of our interconnectedness with our living and our dead, and so contributes to community. The work of mourning requires us to resist the narcissistic pull to collapse the lost other into me, and instead nurture their distinctive memory and the memory of the we of shared experience with them. Thank you.
Chers et chers collègues étudiantes et étudiants, cher Paco, cher professeur Alessandra Lemma, laissez-moi d'abord vous adresser la parole dans mon rôle organisationnel de cette soirée de partage à la fois intellectuel et aussi émotionnel, et vous remercier de votre présence ce soir. Nous avons pensé à cette soirée comme transmettant non seulement un travail scientifique et conceptuel, mais aussi une opportunité d'un partage pertinent à la formation et à la pratique de la clinique psychothérapeutique. Enfin, nous avons souhaité que cette soirée signifie un regroupement autour d'une valeur humaniste qui nous est chère au réseau francophone des thérapies basées sur la mentalisation. Afin de rendre cette soirée possible, nous avons reçu le soutien de l'Université de Genève et en particulier des décanats de la Faculté de psychologie et des sciences de l'éducation, ainsi que la présidence de la section de psychologie que je remercie chaleureusement. Mesdames Sandra Degratia et Isabelle Descombes nous ont soutenus dans nos efforts d'organisation et de communication respectivement, comme vous pouvez en témoigner par la magnifique affiche notamment, et je tiens à leur souhaiter ma gratitude. Je souhaite aussi souligner la contribution des hôpitaux universitaires de Genève par l'entremise du service de psychiatrie de liaison et d'intervention de crise dirigé par le professeur Prada, et je salue l'équipe des lits d'intervention de crise. Je tiens également à souligner le travail clinique informé par la mentalisation effectué à l'unité des troubles de la régulation émotionnelle, avec qui j'ai le privilège de travailler depuis plusieurs années, et plus récemment à l'unité du Lison qui m'accorde cette opportunité de collaboration. Je peux témoigner de l'engagement humain exceptionnel du personnel auprès des usagers et de la passion et aussi du soin qui les anime. Le personnel infirmier, médical et psychologique est pour moi une source d'inspiration quotidienne. Enfin, j'aimerais remercier Denis Cartoglou, Margot Bouteloup, professeur Nader Perrou, professeur Mario Speranza et professeur Karine Hensing pour le travail et l'enthousiasme dégagé à l'organisation de cette soirée et aussi annuellement pour organiser nos conférences publiques. C'est un privilège d'être entouré par de telles individualités et de telles équipes. J'aimerais enfin remercier la professeure Alessandra Lemma d'avoir accepté notre invitation. C'est un honneur de vous recevoir à Genève et d'enfin avoir la chance d'échanger depuis une perspective que je crois nous partageons, celle de la psychodynamique contemporaine, celle de la nécessité de travailler les perspectives psychanalytiques à la lumière des phénomènes et des disciplines contemporaines, en clarifiant un propos pour qu'il soit accessible, autant qu'il respecte la complexité humaine, et qu'il signifie tout ce qui nous reste à apprendre, tout ce qui nous échappe encore, tout tant dans nos vies que dans nos pratiques. J'aimerais donc offrir quelques réflexions provoquées en grande partie par la lecture de votre texte présenté ce soir et aussi publié dans l'International Journal of Psychoanalysis. Dans son allocution, la professeure Lemma nous confronte, certes avec beaucoup de délicatesse, à une expérience aussi inévitable que le désir qu'elle suscite de l'éviter. Je parle bien sûr de l'expérience de la perte, et en particulier de la perte inimaginable d'un être proche. En articulation avec la présentation de la professeure Lemma, j'aimerais donc proposer que ces pertes sont non seulement dans leur dimension bouleversante, motivante de conduite nouvelle, avec notamment les intelligences artificielles dites génératives, mais aussi que ces pertes offrent l'opportunité d'une puissante expérience humaine, celle de la transformation par le processus de deuil, pour autant que nous nous y sentions de nous y engager. Et comme sans doute vous pouvez le ressentir, je suis ambivalent moi-même à m'y engager. La préparation de cette allocution a été des plus difficiles. J'ai perdu un être cher que je considère comme un de mes plus valeureux enseignants. De manière brutale, la maladie l'a emporté en 5 semaines. Vous m'excuserez donc si dans mon propos de ce soir, l'émotion est encore très vive et les réflexions sans doute inabouties. Mais j'aimerais dédier mon allocution à toutes celles et ceux qui, présentes ce soir, peut-être vivaient aussi ou avaient vécu un deuil. J'imagine que ce n'est pas le hasard qui vous a amené à cette conférence. Les IA génératives spécialisées dans le deuil, telles qu'évoquées par la professeure Lemma, s'appuient sur un filon qui est de plus en plus à la mode dans le marketing, celui de la santé mentale. Il se trouve que dans ma fonction d'enseignant, cela fait 15 ans que je réfléchis avec les étudiantes et avec les étudiants à ce sujet de la santé mentale. Et depuis quelques années, je témoigne, peut-être comme vous dans les médias, qui présente implicitement la santé mentale comme un état de bien-être en continu, où des interruptions de ce bien-être équivaudraient à du mal-être. C'est donc dire que l'inconfort, voire les états de forte perturbation que nous pouvons vivre autour de cette perte de l'être cher et l'amorce d'un processus de deuil, tous ces vécus dits négatifs provoqués par l'expérience de la perte d'un être cher sont malheureusement confondus avec des états qu'on qualifie trop rapidement de mots cliniques, psychiatriques, psychopathologiques. Même la psychologie affective, cette science qui m'est chère, qualifie la valence de la tristesse ou de la colère comme négative. Ce qualificatif est lourd de sens, peut-être même trop lourd. Cela vaudrait-il la peine de trouver un autre mot que négatif? La tristesse n'est-elle pas en elle-même une intelligence générative? En effet, qu'en serait-il si nous portions notre attention de manière équivalente sur ce que les émotions dites négatives peuvent contribuer, et pas seulement l'injonction qu'elles stimulent à être régulées? Qu'en serait-il si nous pouvions conceptualiser la santé mentale en y intégrant ces états de perte, les sentiers déboussolants, perturbants, dérangeants, qu'emprunte le processus de deuil? Néanmoins, si je suis honnête, je dois avouer que mon vécu actuel de la perte et du deuil, de ces états, sont difficilement conciliables avec une positivité, tant le sentier semble ardu. Devons-nous chercher un remède à la mélancolie? Oui, le deuil nous confronte à une réduction de nos capacités, de notre efficacité, peut-être de notre présence. Nous perdons une partie de nous-mêmes, souvent nous perdons une relation irremplaçable. Comment diable ces états déstabilisants pourraient-ils nous contribuer à la santé? On est en droit de se le demander. Avec l'injonction au bien-être en continu subtilement soufflée dans l'usage grand public de l'expression santé mentale, on affirme tout aussi volontiers qu'exprimer ses émotions est bon pour la santé. Mais la plupart des gens n'y croient pas toujours, du moins pas assez pour s'engager eux-mêmes à exprimer certaines de leurs émotions les plus pénibles et les plus intimes. Trop de risques, risque social, gestion de l'image, risque de stigmatisation bien sûr, mais aussi un risque intérieur. Car toute émotion, lorsqu'elle nous envahit et occupe unilatéralement l'ensemble de notre expérience, comme peut le faire l'effet émotionnel d'une perte, va désintriquer aussi, à des degrés variables, notre conception et notre expérience du temps. On vit alors comme figé dans l'infini de ce ressenti, en sentant qu'on est potentiellement en danger de jamais en sortir. Alessandra Lemma nous rappelle qu'au travers du contact et du partage affectif de la perte d'un être cher avec l'entourage, c'est notamment la réception de nos émotions par ceux qui nous entourent qui permet progressivement, non pas la régulation, mais la modulation de l'émotion, précisément par l'enrichissement qu'apporte l'expérience d'être ensemble émotionnellement. Certes, la perte de l'être cher ne génère pas des vécus identiques chez tous et chacun, mais provoque bel et bien des émotions communes, comme dans le mot « communauté ». Le sentiment d'appartenir, d'être dans une relation ou un groupe est issu de l'expérience d'être non seulement reconnu dans sa manière de sentir, mais aussi dans le fait que ces personnes qui reconnaissent doublement à la fois notre émotion et aussi l'expérience humaine commune de cette solitude inouïe à laquelle nous sommes confrontés par la perte de l'être cher. C'est donc le partage de cette solitude intolérable et de la complexité émotionnelle qui s'ensuit qui rend le processus de deuil non seulement plus tolérable, mais potentiellement génératif. Les mots du texte de la professeure Lemma tissent une toile extrêmement riche et complexe, issue des champs de la philosophie, de la psychanalyse, de la psychologie et aussi de la sociologie. Cela est sans doute une nécessité, car la mort, c'est l'affaire de tout le monde, de tous les champs d'investigation. Il y a cependant un mot qui n'apparaît pas dans son texte, spiritualité. Cette absence ne constitue pas en soi un manquement à mes yeux. On sait que certains puristes, soit de la psychanalyse ou des sciences dites dures, traitent ce mot un peu comme un gros mot. Mais je ne suppose que cela ne soit pas le cas pour la professeure Lemma, tant l'écho de ces mots appelle à considérer la dimension spirituelle que convoque la présence de l'absence. Ici, la présence de la mort dans nos vies, inévitablement et inlassablement convoquée, contre laquelle on se défend, comme on dit chez nous, comme des diables dans l'eau bénite. Mon propos ici n'est pas d'immiscer l'une ou l'autre des grandes religions dans la discussion thématique de ce soir, mais plutôt de nous rappeler que le phénomène de la vie et de la mort est plus grand que nous dépasse totalement, et en ce sens, nous contraint à une sorte de prise de perspective sur nous-mêmes. Cette prise de perspective sur soi s'inscrit en effet dans la définition philosophique du mot spiritualité, à savoir tout ce qui se rapporte à l'esprit de ce qu'il n'est pas ou plus. Le mot spiritualité désigne même parfois des aspects esthétiques de l'expérience. Donc, si la présence de l'absence nous contraint à une prise de perspective, qu'est-ce que cette prise de perspective révèle? Entre autres, elle révèle et nous confronte radicalement à la qualité éphémère de nos objets d'amour, voire de notre propre existence. En cela, la combinaison vie-mort est bouleversante. Même Freud, confronté à la perte de sa fille, comme nous le rappelle Alessandra Lemma dans son texte, a utilisé ses outils intellectuels et émotionnels pour tenter de faire naître une forme de compréhension au sein d'une expérience incompréhensible, ce qui l'a mené à formuler sa théorie sur la dualité des instincts de vie et des instincts de mort. En sommes-nous satisfaits de cette théorie? A-t-elle encore une utilité? Y en a-t-il d'autres plus satisfaisantes? J'aime penser que la théorisation est un élément nécessaire et insuffisant, un outil dont chaque génération s'emploie pour tenter de formuler ces compréhensions qui les assisteront au travers du cheminement de la vie pour ne pas se perdre dans ces turbulences et ces abîmes. La prise de perspective est donc à la fois insuffisante, source de mécontentement, mais également gardienne de la vitalité de la vie. Je souhaiterais donc remercier la professeure Lemma pour cette proposition aussi sensible que radicale, qu'est celle de prendre le temps de penser la mort dans nos sociétés contemporaines, et en particulier à la manière d'Émile Durkheim, aux habitus que nous créons pour tenter de traiter ce problème insoluble. Professeur Lemma s'inscrit, me semble-t-il, dans le projet de prise de perspective sur nous-mêmes, sur notre relation à la perte, sur ce qui perdure au travers du rapport au défunt et qui, en même temps, n'existe plus en vertu de la disparition de l'être cher. Dans son texte et par l'entremise du concept du deuil originaire de Derrida, notre conférencière nous confronte à la dimension interminable du deuil. Une œuvre d'art n'est jamais terminée, dira l'artiste. Une analyse interminable, dira Freud. Et pourtant, nous vivons dans l'illusion que nous terminons les choses. Nous terminons un projet. Nous terminons un appel téléphonique. Ce soir, nous terminerons la soirée. Notre conférencière nous suggère-t-elle que ceci est une illusion? Car la fin d'un projet, d'une conversation téléphonique ou la fin de la soirée, sont autant d'interruptions relationnelles dont nous ne contrôlons ni la réalité, ni l'effet que leur absence aura sur nous. Comme la perte d'un être cher, qui nous impose la fin d'une relation dont nous ne pouvons pas contrôler l'effet que son absence créera sur nous. En reprenant l'enregistrement de cette soirée, vous pourrez en partie faire revivre les émotions, réflexions, climat intérieur qu'elles stimulent en vous, mais il sera impossible de poursuivre la soirée en soi. Le passé est passé. Donc, la perspective est un peu grise. Si on aurait raison et que tout ça est interminable, pourquoi commencer? Sachant que ça va être pénible, voire insupportable, pourquoi diable nous encourager à s'engager dans ce processus qui, somme toute, est quoi? Du masochisme? À la différence du masochisme, le scénario du deuil a l'ambition de ne pas tourner en rond. Il n'est pas dans une quête obsessionnelle de l'exactitude du scénario. Il ne cherche pas à provoquer un registre de sensations particulier, mais recherche une élaboration d'un vécu imposé et trop dense. Le projet du deuil propose le pénible sentier de la prise de perspective, comme trajet vers la transformation de notre relation à l'objet perdu, vers la transformation peut-être de soi, vers des transformations avec les autres, avec un grand A, que nous ne connaissons pas encore. Et à l'orée de ce sentier, au moment de la perte, tout cela semble plus souvent qu'autrement catastrophique. D'où l'expression « catastrophic change » du psychanalyste W.R. Bion. Et dans ce projet de deuil, il n'y a pas de plaisir à la douleur, comme dans le masochisme, mais bien la cohabitation d'un vécu catastrophique avec une forme d'intuition que devant l'inévitable, le sentier du deuil peut suivre, titubant, trébuchant, des prises de perspective pouvant enrichir et approfondir notre présence au monde, aux autres, à soi et peut-être même aux défunts, sans malheureusement nous faire échapper ni à la perte, ni à la nature éphémère de notre propre existence. Le projet du deuil n'est donc pas alléchant. Et pour reprendre un terme psychanalytique, il n'y a pas de séduction propre au projet du deuil. Il y a même l'abandon d'une séduction au profit de la pénible intégration de la dimension réelle de la relation, en partie perdue. Pourquoi seulement en partie ? Peut-être qu'étant dotés de mémoire, nous sommes des êtres qui conservons naturellement une partie de notre vécu avec l'autre. Et une des fonctions cognitives de la mémoire est qu'à part être une faculté qui oublie, elle est également désormais plébiscitée par les neuroscientifiques comme une faculté qui construit, notamment qui projette dans le futur, et ces constructions projetées dans le futur contribuent sans doute à une sorte d'équilibre entre la présence et l'absence. Pour conclure, le texte de la professeure Lemma m'a souvent fait associer à cette phrase fréquemment prononcée en marge de funérailles. Les uns et les autres se disent. Ouais, tout ça, c'est encore un rappel qu'il faut vivre la vie pleinement, car on ne sait jamais combien de temps elle dure. Le processus de deuil est orienté vers ce qu'on pourrait appeler vivre la vie pleinement dans toutes ses couleurs, textures, d'expériences, négatives inclus, tant qu'on est encore vivant. Il y a bien sûr d'autres alternatives, notamment celle de vivre la vie en rêvant, ou mieux encore, en délirant de manière contrôlée. Mais je ne me spécialise pas dans la concrétisation des délires contemporains. Je laisse volontiers les GAFA vous séduire à vous y engager. Pour ce soir, je me contenterai de faire l'écho des propos de la professeure Lemma, à que ce chemin du deuil comporte des risques, à ce que ce chemin de l'utilisation des IA comporte des risques et périls, à la présence que nous avons dans nos vies propres, à la relation que nous entretenons avec nous-mêmes, aux relations aux êtres chers qui sont toujours vivants autour de nous, comme l'a si brillamment illustré cet épisode de la série Black Mirror. Même dans les rêves et les délires, nous dit Alessandra Lemma, il y a l'enjeu de ne pas rester seul. Je dirais que c'est en cela qu'il y a un élément fondamentalement social, cette dimension de l'existence à laquelle nous invite radicalement la perte et le deuil. Oui, nous pouvons ressentir, certes, beaucoup d'excitation à voir à quel point nous appliquons notre intelligence humaine et collective à rêver un monde d'humains augmenté d'espérance de vie de plus en plus longue, voire éternelle, afin de vaincre une des seules choses sur laquelle l'humain n'a pas encore capitalisé, sa propre mort. Sans préjuger du succès d'Elon Musk et d'autres, auront sur l'infinité de nos existences. En attendant, c'est avec une certaine récalcitrance que je tente de faire face à la perte, à l'éphémère des relations et de la vie, à la mort qui vient cueillir les êtres chers. La seule promesse du sentier du deuil se trouve dans ce qui nous reste à découvrir ensemble.